Okay, so I've obviously given to most of you this talk before. The good news is there's more data this time. So I'm going to be discussing the relationship between quality of life and biophysical and economic conditions. And this all started, this is a small synopsis for those people who have not been part of this, back in 2012 when Charlie and I and a group of his graduate students started working on, and AJ, yes, started working for the Department for International Development on a grant that they sponsored that wanted us to look at how we could apply things like energy return on investment to a policy, okay, to give them some way of informing the way in which they operate and they use their funds using our research. And one of the things that we did was we started to develop something called the Energy Return on Investment for Society, which was an attempt to expand the boundaries that are conventional to EROI to try to encompass the amount of energy that is used in the society and the amount of output that the society delivers. And we did this by utilizing Kaufman and Hall's 1981 paper that worked on energy return on investment for imported oil. And we expanded that theory to use that equation to create the EROI for society equation, which is the tiny one up there, which I know you can't read. But I promise you these will be published online, so you can look at that at your leisure. And what we did was we basically used the ratio of net energy contributions, and we weighted each energy source, which was basically the energy per unit of fuel divided by the price per unit of that fuel, and that was weighted by its contribution to that economic system, and that was then divided by the energy intensity for that economy. And what we found was that countries with that ended up having lower EROI for society values tended to rely fairly heavily on lower EROI fuels. So in, for instance, Ethiopia, 2-to-1 ratio, India, 10-to-1, and the United Kingdom was 40-to-1. Now the interesting thing about this is that these, if you've ever read Smill, he likes to work with energy per capita, and he likes to relate those to quality of life indices. And frankly, there's a very good correlation using a logarithmic curve. We found that the energy per capita delivered into a society and its correlation with Human Development Index and other indices of quality of life, and the correlation between EROI for society and its correlation with HDI were independently correlated. So what this meant was that there was an incremental change. For an incremental change in EROI for society, you would get more bang for your buck to improve the quality of life of countries that had, you know, poorer countries, lower income countries. If you improved their energy, you would have a correspondingly higher quality of life relative to, say, if you dumped more energy into the United States economy. And the conclusion of this research was that obviously the goal was to get to a point in which you were above that curve. So you were no longer, you could improve you could create the greatest improvement by increasing the amount of energy that was available mainly to those countries that were developing, and that, in theory, was correlated and might be causative, although we have not proved that, with improvements in quality of life. So since these two theories were independent, or these two correlations were independent, we decided to create a combined energy index for the purposes of policy, to try to incorporate both quantity, efficiency, and distribution of energy within the economic system. And then we ended up finding that it actually had a very high EROI. Unfortunately, these are smaller on your screen. And so the bottom graph there is the combined energy index. It has a correlation coefficient of 8.8.
Not a high EROI, a high correlation.
Sorry?
You found it had a high, you said EROI, I think you mean we found it had a high correlation. The Lambert Index has a higher correlation than any of its components.
That's correct. But a combined index is largely used for policy purposes. So you can get, when you do a combined index, what you're trying to do is use a tool that tries to incorporate various components and tries to interpret them for someone else. So for instance, the Human Development Index doesn't mean that there aren't other things that need to be interpreted in order to know about well-being. It just helps us to utilize a standardized form for evaluation. So we found that this was basically, it had the same correlation coefficient as GDP. Oops. Okay, on to our new research. So what we did was we decided to expand these boundaries and do a time series analysis. When we started this, we started with the developed countries because there's more data, frankly. The problem with doing developed countries is that they are further up on the curve. So what we did is we expanded the boundaries and we went all the way back to 1990 because that's when we could collect data. And we found that the same correlation basically applied back then. And then this is EROI for society. But unfortunately, LEI was basically useless because if you look at some of the earlier data points, there's so much inconsistency in the number of data points that are available and are published that we couldn't use a combined energy index. So for the purposes of much of what you're going to see next, we're going to ignore that. So we ended up finding that this data, basically the trend remained very similar no matter which year you applied it to. So then we decided, well, what if we start looking at these countries independently? Okay, what would the correlation be? Because the correlation wasn't enormously high. 0.7 R-squared ratio is not bad, don't get me wrong, but it's not necessarily good. So let's cherry pick 3 different economies. You have the Canadian economy, which is obviously an OECD country. You have India, which is a lower middle income country, and then you have Ethiopia, which is a low income country. And these are their respective EROI for society and energy per capita and Gini index. And what we found was that over time, these graphs are over time, you find that they're incredibly highly correlated with countries that fall into the lower middle income, low income, and upper middle income countries they all tend to have very high correlation coefficients between our energy indices and our quality of life indices. And this is, if you look up there under Ethiopia, that purple thing, that's the amount of energy that they're reliant upon that is biomass based. Okay, I know, I'm sorry. I did try. And then over in India, that blue, that's coal. And if you look at Canada, the blue is coal, the yellow is petroleum. So if you're looking at these, you can see that they're reliant upon a higher energy return on investment fuel source. And it's not overly surprising that they're able to fund more with their energy, the higher EROI fuels, to improve their quality of life. But the correlation coefficient for India was really rather striking because over the 15-year timeline that this is showing, we're seeing an R-squared value of 0.96. Okay, that's, you can't get much better than that. And Ethiopia, if you can't see it, is an R-squared value of 0.82. And Canada, of course, is absolutely and utterly useless, which is one of the reasons why it was so hard to do some of the evaluations. Oh, sorry. I didn't mean it in that way. I meant from a trend set basis. We love our Canadian friends. But it establishes no trend, because what you're seeing is that it's already so high on the EROI curve that no incremental increase in gigajoules per capita, no matter how large, actually corresponds with an increase in well-being, at least as defined by the United Nations and the World Bank. Sorry, that was gigajoules per capita. This is energy return on investment for society. The correlation coefficients are also equally high. In Ethiopia, for EROI for society, it's 0.97 for Ethiopia, and India, it's 0.9366. So, once again, incredibly high. And so this is, you can see Ethiopia is on the bottom left, India is in the middle, and there's Canada up in the top. And so this is the EROI for society. And you can see that they're all basically making that logarithmic curve, and that they are fitting that trend as we previously described. And this trend also is the same for other indices that incidentally don't really rely as heavily on GDP. Gender Inequality Index here, and for Ethiopia it's a 0.98, and for India it's 0.95. That's gigajoules per capita. And then for EROI for society, Ethiopia is 0.98 again, and with more numbers. And India is 8.89. So the thing is that it's obvious. Oh, this is the education index. And unfortunately, Ethiopia, being such an impoverished country, does not actually have data for the education index. But for the data that does exist, obviously, India has another 0.96. So we then cherry-picked several more countries, because we did this for 127 countries all over the world. And we expanded this boundary for the 15-year timeline. And we found that the correlation was incredibly good for most countries. There were a few wild cards, but basically a lot of the research that has been coming out has focused very strongly on either extreme upper middle income or OECD countries, because that's where the data is available. However, you won't actually see any trends. You might be able to use it for other purposes, but unfortunately the trends don't exist. So the only way we can actually really evaluate this is if we can start looking at countries where it's more likely to be impactful. So we want to focus the policy that we're making to improve overall energy quality, and we want to try to structure it so that you get the biggest bang for your buck. You want to end up improving low-middle income countries and lower income countries by ensuring that they can have greater access to energy, and that obviously it does have a large impact on that society. It also kind of throws a bit of a kink in some of the issues that are associated with trying to handle climate change, because obviously this is a highly correlative evaluation. You know, it's obvious that an increase in energy availability is highly correlated with well-being, and if you're going to improve well-being for the people in these countries, you have to improve energy availability. And unfortunately, in cases like Ethiopia, biomass has not been an option that has actually been viable. You've had to prop up countries' economies, like India with the coal and the other petroleum resources, that have allowed them to expand their, yes? Oh, sorry. Sorry, I thought you raised your hand. Gesturing. Oh, okay. So, unfortunately, and I will say this, while we do have incredible data on a few of the low-income countries, the majority of the low-income countries basically are dataless, because they don't get funding, and the funding they do for data collection, and frankly, the infrastructure in their countries make it very difficult to collect data, and so the data that is available is spotty at best. But I think that we can basically interpret, given the trend, that access to more energy will probably improve their condition. Now, one of the things that we concluded in our previous research was that the low-income countries, there were a few of them that actually did quite well. relative to their low-income status. And those countries, you can see them there, they are significantly higher on the curve than their cohorts. And those countries are Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Now they do not have a lot of access to energy. However, they have a significantly higher HDI value and LEI value than those countries next to them. And I would suggest that the reason behind this is because Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan rely very heavily on hydroelectric that was basically sponsored by the USSR. The Russians, Soviets, came in and they built the infrastructure for them, which has a policy implication, which means that if you're going to improve quality of life in countries that are so impoverished, you're going to have to do so in an infrastructural way that means that they don't have to be reliant upon a fluctuating energy market.
Are you answering Feng's question?
I don't know.
You asked a question about communism and capitalism or whatever. You asked that question. I think she's answering it.
Well,
am I? Well, there goes the political career completely. Well, so that there is something to be said for that. What it means is that countries, there are all sorts of socio-political components to this. But one of the takeaways is that in a country where the government secures and sponsors big projects like this, and it's not reliant upon companies who are looking for a profit and not looking for long-term, basically returns on their investments, you are going to end up getting better projects like this because the countries are working on a 5-year timeline for the return on their investment. They're looking at it for the extended, for the future. So that is an implication. The other implication is that those countries that are low-income countries, that are heavily reliant upon either imported fuels, which they are at a disadvantage for getting and are not capable of really paying for, or that are reliant heavily on biofuels or burning wood, which is inefficient in many ways, basically they're kind of stuck. And incidentally, in Ethiopia, that net improvement actually was tied to improvement in access to, unfortunately, a fossil fuel-based energy source. So it was an incremental increase because of their access to that. So, when you're seeing improvement in these countries, we're going to have to start making some tough questions and tough choices with regards to how do we ameliorate our issue with regards to our environmental and climatic responsibilities and our humanitarian responsibilities. So, let's work on trying to improve overall EROI fuels. And any questions or comments? Yes.
You had the energy cliff graph up a little while ago, which is quite common these days. Mm-hmm. Who created that? Is that you guys?
I did. It's not. I mean, it was a reinterpretation of the work that the gentleman from Scotland did.